So we are in chapter 2 tonight. How to be an encourager. We're going to eventually talk about Barnabas and what an encourager he was. I've mentioned this before, and if you forget that I've mentioned it, then I put the image up there on the screen, so maybe it'll help you to remember. The word courage comes from the old French, from the Latin, which means heart. So encourage means to put the heart into. And we're going to talk about courage tonight. The whole quarter of study is how to be an encourager. So we're going to talk about the power of courage tonight. If we want to be an encourager, if we want to be the kind of person that can put the heart into someone, then let's talk about the power of courage. Somebody read for us 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7. Some commentators picture Timothy as being a timid individual, maybe not a whole lot of self-confidence. They get a lot of that from this verse. Now, I tend to think that they try to squeeze too much out of this verse relative to that. But that's their opinion. Somebody read 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7 for us when you get it there.
God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control.
Okay, so God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Now, how would you define courage? That's one of the questions the author put in the back of this chapter. How would you define courage? Discipline over fear. Any other definitions? What do you think, Jeff? Ex-Marine, what's the definition of courage? Or would you agree with Brandon, discipline over fear?
I agree with Brandon. I'm trying to think of the good comprehensive definitions coming to me.
Yeah. Overcoming fear. So both of those definitions suggest that fear is still there, right?
Ability to persevere in circumstances that seem overwhelming.
Persevere in circumstances that seem overwhelming. Okay, very good. Any others? Marvin?
I read a song where someone made the concept courage is being scared to death.
Courage is being scared to death and doing it anyway. Okay. Jennifer?
Meaningful?
Meaningful?
Yeah, something meaningful towards an objective.
Okay, something meaningful towards an objective in life. Okay. I mentioned last week this song by Anne Murray, and I wanted to share the lyrics with you. This song came out in 1983, so this is the second year of President Reagan's presidency. I was 12 years old in 1983. Listen, this song sounds like it's talking about 2022. I rolled out of bed this morning. Kids had the morning news show on. Bryant Gumbel was talking about the fighting in Lebanon. Some senator squawking about the bad economy. It's going to get worse, you see. We need a change in policy. There's a local paper rolled up in a rubber band. One more sad stories more than I can stand. Just once I'd like to hear the headline say, "Not much to print today, can't find nothing bad to say." Could you imagine a newspaper saying that? Because the rule in journalism is, if it bleeds, it leads. So this is what she would like to hear. Nobody robbed a liquor store on the lower part of town. Nobody OD'd. Nobody burned a single building down. Nobody fired a shot in anger. Nobody had to die in vain. We sure could use a little good news today. Come home this evening, I bet that the news will be the same. And things haven't changed since 1983, have they? somebody takes a hostage, somebody steals a plane, how I want to hear the anchorman talk about a county fair and how we cleaned up the air and how everybody learned to care. Nobody was assassinated in the whole third world today, and in the streets of Ireland, all the children had to do was play, and everybody loves everybody. In the good old USA, we sure could use a little good news today. How accurate is that for our day today? And my point is, you think about, and you may be that person, but think about somebody who feels the weight of that. You turn on the news before you have breakfast, it's all bad news. You pull up the websites. I don't know, does anybody read newspapers anymore? You pull up the website and it's all bad news. You go to work and it's all bad news. You come home and you watch the news while you're fixing dinner and it's all bad news. And you think about the pull that has on people's psychic energy. It's just negative, 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 negative. So the point is, we need encouragement. I mentioned last week, probably what most of us need to do is turn the TV off. Watch less news. In fact, somebody told me, and this was during the George Floyd stuff and all of the riots and everything that was going on across the country during that period of time. And this person said, I'm watching all of this on the news, and it started to make me hate black people. And I said, well, how do you feel about black people that you know? And the person said, well, I love them and I respect them. And I said, good. Sounds to me like you need to turn off the TV. Quit letting the idiot box influence your mind and your heart. The author writes, courage is the inner capacity that enables a person to move ahead toward meaningful goals and objectives in life. That reflects what Jennifer was saying. And we're going to talk tonight. He mentions some things in our lives that require courage. The power of courage is what we're talking about. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 6. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6. Once again, the book of Deuteronomy is 3 sermons that Moses gives the Israelites while they're camped on the east side of the Jordan River on the plains of Moab before they cross over the Jordan and they conquer Jericho. It's during this time frame that God is taking the leadership away from Moses and he's going to give it to his successor. So somebody read Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6 for us.
Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them. The Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you.
So Moses is speaking to Israel, and he says, be strong and courageous. I mentioned these 2 Hebrew words last week to help us understand what Moses is saying. The word be strong, chazak, is the basis of the name King Hezekiah. The H, Z, and K in Hezekiah is the verb to be strong. And then the word be of good courage comes from the word for truth. And the verb associated with truth means to establish. It means to verify, to make strong. When we talk about the fact that miracles establish the truth of Christianity, we mean that miracles, the performance of miracles, put a foundation underneath the truth to give people a reason to believe the truth. So Moses tells Israel, be strong and be of good courage. Notice he says, do not be afraid. That Hebrew expression, do not be afraid, is used 78 times in the Old Testament. I checked in the English, and it's used 58 times in English. Do not be afraid. 78 times in the Old Testament, God told his people, do not be afraid. Do not fear. do not fear. Do not be afraid is used less times. 3 in Hebrew, 47 times in English. Back to verse 6. What is the basis on which Moses tells Israel to be strong and of good courage and don't fear and don't be afraid? What's the basis? Because the Lord is with us. Because the Lord is with us. The Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you.
I like the way it says goes with you rather than just you see him once in a while.
He goes with you. That's ongoing presence, isn't it? It's not that God pops in and pops out of your life. He's with you every step of the way. God is present in our lives. And that in and of itself should give us courage, right? Johnson writes, page 28, a sense of God's closeness still ignites courage in believers today. He uses Daniel as an example. We talked about Daniel. We had 2 lessons at BBS from the life of Daniel. Give me an example of how Daniel had courage in his life.
When he was first like a young man starting to be schooled there, they were going to be fed by the king's table, and he refused to eat what didn't agree with God's law.
Right. A young man. And in fact, based on the chronology of the book of Daniel, Daniel lived to be quite old, which means Daniel chapter 1 he's quite young. Maybe teenage years. And the king, you remember, the king wanted to feed these Hebrew boys all different kinds of foods, and they were good food. You know, I love a good pork chop and pork ribs. But Daniel wouldn't do it. Law of Moses said no. And Daniel decided in his heart that he was going to stay faithful to God. Can't we find a lot of courage in life when we've already decided in our hearts that we're going to be faithful to God? Doesn't that make a lot of decisions for us? You know, we come to forks in our lives, and really they're not forks in our lives because we know I can't go down that path because that wouldn't honor God. So my prior commitment to be faithful to God has already made the decision for me. So it's not like I have to have the courage to make the right decision. I'm going to make the decision that keeps me faithful to God. Johnson wrote in the book that Daniel was maintaining a covenant relationship with God as his top priority. And we see that in Daniel chapter 1. Where's another example of Daniel's courage? Praying in the lion's den. Staying faithful to God despite the threat of being thrown in the lion's den. He was thrown in the lion's den, and God closed the lions' mouths. Where's another example? Praying 3 times a day. Yep. Despite the fact that the king said, pray to me, he prayed to Jehovah God.
Told Nebuchadnezzar the truth about his visions, didn't back down.
Yes, and I was specifically thinking about the vision in chapter 4, but we go back to chapter 2 with his visions. Chapter 4 is where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream about him becoming an animal, right? And Daniel had the courage to say, the God of heaven revealed this to me. You're that animal, and God's going to depose you. God's the one who raises leaders and takes them down. That's verses 17 and 18 in chapter 4. We might read through that and just kind of skim over it without it really impacting our hearts and the fact that Daniel could have been killed for saying that to the king. It did take courage for Daniel to say, here's what God said. And that's the kind of courage that you and I need to have when we're sharing the Word of God with other people. I can't apologize. I won't apologize for what God has said. Here's what God has said. And if it causes us to have a ruptured relationship, I had to rupture a relationship with a fellow preacher just a few weeks ago. The conversation went well as far as that was concerned, but it was the end of our relationship. There was a verse in the Bible that condemned him where he was. He tried to explain what it didn't mean. And I said, well, you tried to explain what it doesn't mean. Now tell me what it does mean. He said, I don't know. And it's as plain as it could be. So from one perspective, that hurt, but I'm not going to violate God's law and my convictions relative to God's word for that friendship. Any other thoughts about Daniel?
The times that we mentioned were kind of pinnacle points in his life. He ruled in a kingdom that was very much against God. On a day-to-day basis, we know from inference that he was a man of integrity and he ruled well. And he wouldn't take bribes, and so his fellow satraps despised him.
Brandon makes a really good point. The events that we have recorded from Daniel's life are kind of the pinnacle points in his life. And yet it was the daily, everyday events in his life, him praying 3 times a day and being a person of integrity, especially relative to God and His Word. That's what aroused the ire of the Babylonian wise men and astrologers and magicians, and what motivated them to want to have him thrown into the lion's den. It was that daily life that convicted the people around him.
His consistency,
His consistency, yeah.
his act of bravery, not to, like, even though he knew the consequences, he just went straight, no matter what any consequences